I'm just blushing. That goes to, there's a little bit hint of Welshness there, because I spent at least 20 odd years in South Wales, and it was the first proper place I felt that I belonged after many, many years of migrating. Sometimes after maybe a few glasses of wine, I turn into the Welsh. The Welshness comes through. But it is my absolute delight to be in conversation with not just Dan, the great Dan, but also Onyekachi, who I've admired for a very long time. Now, I'm also very grateful and a delight to finally be here in Housmans. So thank you, and thank you for looking after us. Just to mention that this will be recorded. The first sessions will be recorded, and then the Q&A won't be. So feel free to be as honest as you can, as you feel, to ask questions of all of us, but also perhaps, some of the topics that we are going to be exploring might be quite complex, and we're very happy to provide some personal as well as professional perspectives around there. See, there's diplomacy at work there. So really, I'm just thinking about, we had a conversation downstairs about our kind of personal connections, and the last time I did an event with Dan, it was with MC Hammer. So I feel like that was the pinnacle of my career, and I don't think I could ever actually match that. With Dan, we've known each other for some time. I was in Oxford for about 11, 12 years, and in some sense, when you started having conversations around the Pitt Rivers, I've done some decolonisation work with the current director, when you talk about the Oriel College, and we talk about the man who will not be named.
Yeah, we should talk about that right now, shouldn't we? We should just say we're going to try to have this conversation without naming any of those bastards at all in the next hour. We'll see if we get away with it, because it goes to show how hard it is not to say the names.
Yeah, we're going to play bingo in the not naming game. But also I wanted to kind of start with the kind of personal connection as well, because what comes across in Dan's book is not just the kind of professional, because obviously he's an incredibly eminent professor, and very, very talented. I could go on, but I won't. It's also, this book is really personal because, in a sense, you wrote it during a very difficult time for everyone during COVID, but you lost quite a few of your family members, but also an incredibly dear friend and colleague, and sorry to start off with that. But just that sense of that mixing of the professional and personal, which, I'm intrigued by, because I think as academics and journalists and professionalists, we are sort of navigating that area where, it's okay to be subjective. We cannot constantly be objective and on the sidelines commenting on history or current affairs without bringing in the personal perspective, without it having some sort of feelings towards that. So in a sense, this book is not just about this absolutely enormous knowledge that Dan has and his views on not just monuments, it's not just about monuments, but also about your kind of personal loss and the thread that goes through the book about that loss. And it's the subtitle of this is Remembering and Forgetting, and who gets forgotten, who gets remembered, and yes, in that sense. So the other connection we had is Andrew Sherratt, who I didn't realise he taught you, and I never met Andrew Sherratt, who's a very eminent archaeologist who was in Oxford, but I did get to know him via a friend of mine, Claire Sherratt, who was the daughter of Andrew and Susan Sherratt, who showed me around Oxford when I first arrived there, and in a sense it was a different world for me as someone who never went to Oxford or Cambridge, and then I ended up there, and the navigation of the heavy legacy of imperialism and colonialism that Oxford has, but also in my encounter as being a strong part of the BME staff network, and during the turbulent times of having the first female vice chancellor who was also very resistant to change. So I just wanted to start off with that in terms of the reflecting on that kind of personal, but also feeding that thread in how you've seen the book. And then I also want to bring Onyekachi in this as well.
Okay, thanks, May, and hi, everyone. And on that, it's so nice to be with you both, because, as you say, we've both got, in between us, we've got different links and different histories. And in some ways, this is a book about how we think about such relationships and how we find the tone and the voice for talking about the histories that we're, addressing. So in the writing of this book, which on the one side, well, it's about sort of two intertwined themes or histories, if you like. On the one side, there are the histories of those who don't just get remembered, but get memorialised, and not just in Oxford or places like that, but all over the place, in statues, and no one quite knows who the Major General on the horse is, but if you go and read, there's a name that's important to somebody, supposedly, in the names of the roads that we live on or walk down, in the names that are written on the labels in the museums that say who gave this object, but not necessarily who made it or from whom it was taken, or who out there somewhere might be asking for it to be returned. So on the one side, there is the memorialisation, and on the other, there's who gets forgotten, and not just forgotten like you accidentally forget something, but erased or silenced, or in the case of the woman, because a lot of those men I was just talking about are men, in terms of the woman whose body in this instance was, after death, abused in this way, in what, of course, at Worcester College was an all-male college, as so many of them were until as recently as 1979. So this is a history that's important to write on both sides, but how do you find the tone? So I was writing it at a time of sort of personal loss. My dad died, and then my mum died, and then as I was at the end of the process, my sister died after a long sort of period of addiction. And then also Mary Beaudry, who I've edited books with and so on, and to whom the book is actually, dedicated, who was an American historical archaeologist with whom I'd worked for so long, and who taught me so much about how archaeology is about trying to tell a story, how we don't always have to put the fragments back, together, that sometimes we can, as the book says, stay with the fragments and think about them in those ways. So the tone that came out of the process, of the editorial process, and I have to say that, Penguin were amazingly supportive and sort of pushed me into writing a book I never thought I'd be, a very different tone, to things I've written in the past and to the British Museums, which was my last book. But what the book does is or what I found in the writing process was a use of the second person. And so a lot of the book is written in what you might call the vocative or the invocative. And the vocative is the voice in which we might address the dead, or we might, say a prayer. And it seemed to me that second person, because it turns out the pronouns are really important, and not only in the ways that we all know that pronouns are important, but in terms of the we or the I, and how that can turn into an our heritage, our museums. Who is that who's part of that third person, of that first person, and who is not? How can we talk about who gets named and who doesn't? And so the pronouns are one way of getting around that. But the second person, I hope in the book, and a couple of people that have read it as far as the end have said this, and I hope it's the case, is that the you, which moves around, at some points it's Mary, at some points it's the people I've gone on sort of walks around Hyde Park with and various other things, at some points it's sort of colleagues and people I've taught and other people I've taught with in environments like this. But also, I hope by the end of the book, it's also the reader in some ways, because this is something we can't do on our own. This isn't something in the old fix of the 90s for this sort of work as a middle-aged white male museum worker at an elite institution. And actually, if, maybe that's actually more of the sort of all those things. Actually, the most of the problematic side of that. Would it be enough simply to state my positionality? And to be reflexive, as we used to say, in that sort of 90s fix of how to do this, and then everything just carries on as usual? Or do we have to find some way to dismantle and decenter our own voices? And so that sort of voice that you talk about and all of the relationships was something I learned out of a period of loss. It helped me write about the loss of who this unnamed woman is, but also to think about the grief and loss that's involved in empire, and to think fundamentally that what we need to think about here is not endurance, but survival. So I'm an archaeologist, so I work on the present in order to understand the past. In many ways, that's the opposite of what a historian does. The historian sort of thinks themselves back into the past and moves forward in time. For the archaeologist, we start with the most recent layer and we dig down, and we work in that way. So yeah, I think for those reasons, in those ways, the foregrounding of voices is at the heart of it.
Yeah, it's so important, isn't it? I was actually thinking, the sort of the as you're reading it, it's a journey. It really takes you not just in terms of physical places, but in terms of emotional, and the fact that it's when you use the you. It is a kind of exercise of check-in as well, of your thoughts, what your colleagues, your friends, etc. have said, to also comment on what you've done and doing, and checking yourself but also before you wreck yourself. Exactly. And what that's doing as well, in part, is to look at, because archaeology is about the present, we don't ask simply, when it comes to a statue, to the origins of apartheid and the intellectual beginnings of the colour line and the violence in the history of sort of Southern Africa. We don't start simply by saying, how could that happen in the first place? Although it's a very good question, how such a monument as that and many other monuments across the country and around the world have been erected. But actually the other question, the archaeological question, is how has it been made to endure? And that's what I mean about, are we able not just to focus on the monuments that are made to endure, but actually refocus on the communities that have managed to survive? Would you like to come in, or you're quite?
Yeah, I was interested in Dan talking about that process of writing and who you engage with and who you interact with as you're writing, and that whole process. I've been, published a number of books, and at the heart of all of them was actually the last book was actually written to a young journalist who I did the first volume of the book. It's called Empire Windrush, about Black British history since the Windrush arrived in 1948. And as somebody from the continent, she asked me why I was writing about a Caribbean experience. And so in the second volume, I tried to explain this in a sense. The first time I just said, well, we all live in the shadow of Windrush. And you can see this as a small story of these individuals who arrive on the ship, or it can be a bigger story of them being the vanguard of a process of mass migration that changes England. Or it could even be a bigger story, because at the same time as they came across in 48, other big things are happening in the world. So India gets its independence, and Communist Party takes power in China, either side of the Windrush arrival. And so there is this moment of the world being recreated. I mean, everybody thinks the post-war period was really the Atlantic settlement or the Atlantic hegemony, but it could also be possible that that period is actually the re-emergence of India and China. And in 100 years, that will be the most important thing, not the Atlantic hegemony. So I was trying to explain to her that you can retreat into this small story, or you can come out and see what you were involved in as part of a bigger historic moment. And so just in terms of who you write, who's in the room with you, who you're writing to, and responding to in a way, and the different voices you're trying to accommodate. A lot of the foreword for that last book was shaped by, well, why didn't I give her a proper answer the first time? I sort of closed down the conversation because I thought we'd get into all this stuff about appropriation and, and all of this stuff. So I was interested in where you situate the book, and given everything we're going through now with this kind of decolonial project, and how you think the book sits in that moment.
Yeah, sure. And so the reason that, or the way in which we know each other, Onyekachi and I, is we've been working together for the past 5 years on issues around restitution. And hopefully before the end of the conversation, we'll get onto the important work of the all-party parliamentary group for African reparations and restitution. But I want, just seeing as you raised the perspective from the continent of Africa, I do just want to say one thing that's about what the book is aiming to do. It seemed to me that there were 3 movements, grassroots movements, long-standing movements, African and indigenous-led movements that go back to around the time you're talking about, which also 48 was also the founding of the NHS, let's remember as well. So 48 is an interesting, and it's important for us in terms of the Human Tissue Act, so we can maybe come back to that. And so these movements are the Fallism movement, which has a long history, from Algeria in the 60s to the removal of someone we're not going to name, from Zambia at independence in 62, from Zimbabwe in 1980, from the University of Cape Town in 2015. So that's a movement that's about monuments in the street. You've got the restitution movement, which again has a long history. The first of the Benin bronzes, which I wrote my last book about, were returned as early as 1938. And restitutions have been a normal part of how museums have worked for a very long time. And third, as well as the Fallism movement and the restitution movement, there is the movement for the decolonization of knowledge. From the streets into the museums, into the libraries and seminar rooms, and actually, conversations like this one, there is, it seems to me, those long-standing movements from the middle of the 20th century and earlier, African and indigenous-led, that are responding to something. Well, what? What are they responding to? What's the history of what they're seeking to push back against? And it seemed to me that what was going on in terms of knowledge, in terms of art, in terms of our museums, was a very tight history, a surprisingly tight history. When you look into when these monuments were put up, into when the looting happened and our museums were co-opted, interspaces for loot in order to tell, the lies over cultural racism in relation to all this language they had of the primitive and the barbaric and so forth, and indeed the making of the disciplines in which we are trained, and what I in the book call the 4 A's, archaeology, anthropology, art and architecture. That nexus of disciplinary, artistic and sort of museological histories happens really between the 1870s and the 1920s. And we don't have a name for it, but we recognise it when we see it, this aesthetic. And that's why in the book I sort of offer a name for it, and I sort of, I give lots of different names. Hey, we could call it that, we could call it that in one of the dialogues. So I offered the name in the end, militarist realism. And militarist realism is a idea that really it's realism in the sense of sort of Mark Fisher. For those who know the great late Mark, his book Capitalist Realism was about the idea, that line that the thing about late capitalism is it seems like it's impossible to imagine the world otherwise. Seems to me that that's what art and culture were being put to work to do, because it's incredibly hard. Once an object has been looted and it's in a museum, it's actually very hard to undertake the process of return. After a monument has been put up, it is designed, this aesthetic, to mix up the man and the monument. So we start talking about he rather than it. And we start saying, it's about this man or that man, right or wrong, rather than about this is a memorial, who do we want to remember? And why, every now and then, is it not okay to change who and how you remember? Who decides who we remember? And how on earth is it possible to live in a world where we've got this kind of ultra extreme example of involuntary memory, where we're forced to have the memories of some guys from the late 19th century or the early 20th century? That was their memories, of what they wanted to remember. Surely we can reshape our memory culture. So the Germans have this sense, a sense that is falling apart at the moment in certain interesting ways, but Erinnerungskultur, memory culture in the German sense, at least they have a word for it, at least they talk about it. In this country, in North America over the Civil War, elsewhere in the world, there are memory cultures, but we're not awfully good often in this country at actually talking about them and thinking about how we turn them into something which is democratic. So at the heart of this book is an argument that there is a democratic right to shape your own memory culture. And this is incredibly important, which is why the proto-fascist movement in between the 1870s and the 1920s put such work into inventing academic disciplines and erecting monuments and stealing objects and putting them into museums.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, carry on.
I was just really interested in that because a lot of this is about how, the narratives that surround memory and who constructs them and all of this stuff. A lot of my work around this is actually about, and going back to a point that you made earlier, Dan, it's also about finding the words to name what is happening. And you talked about, what did you call it? Military realism.
Militarist.
Or militarist realism. But also just to find those words to do that. And describe accurately what's happening. A lot of what has kind of pushed me was, I think I was introduced as having come here after the Biafran War. So I lived through this horrible war, lose my father, lose, uncles, we lost loads of people. And then you're in England and you're like, well, why was my African world broken? And a journey that I've been on is really trying to understand what broke that world. And then that war was about really this space that was put together by the British and the narrative around that space. And before it was put together, it was a company town, like the Royal, like the East India Company put India together. So the Royal Niger Company puts that part of the world, organizes it, and then the state comes in and nationalizes what the Royal Niger Company does. And before that, it was this site of this huge kind of violation of the slave trade. And so as you're trying to work out how you get to, unfortunately, I have to be like the historian, so I'm not starting from the top going down. I'm starting from the back. And you're trying to work out, well, how did we get there to the 1960s? You're finding that actually this thing has been a long time in the making. Mm-hmm. And then I meet that young girl who asked me the question, why am I writing about the Caribbean? And then you think, well, actually, the Windrush wasn't the first ship to come here. Yeah, there were lots of other ships with more difficult cargo. So you start to unwind, and and then how do you name that? We've been doing this work around returning artifacts in the museums, and also around slavery and reparations, and people say, oh, it was so long ago, and the slaves were freed, and all of this. And then you go back 100 years to the anniversary after the abolition of the trade. So we're in 1907. And you look at the press about it. And actually, we're still knee-deep in empire. So it's all celebration about empire. It's not, and Wilberforce. And it's not that we freed the enslaved. And then 100 years later, in 2007, we have a whole year that is dedicated to trying to understand what happened. So what happened between 1907 and 2007? There's a big event in the Westminster Abbey, where the Queen, the Prime Ministers and everybody come in. It's not quite an atonement, because nobody apologizes. But there has been some change. So what happens in that 100 years? And what happens is the Windrush arrives and people start to say, actually, there's a victim's story here that has never been told, the other side of this narrative. So how do we now begin to name that? And then you're confronted with all these statues. I remember when Colston came down, there was a... Oh, okay, I'm fine. I'm going to be fine. When the gentleman in Bristol came down, or the statue.
Not the gentleman.
It wasn't the gentleman, it was the statue. Well, it was the idea of him, wasn't it? So when it comes down, there was a young Bristolian African Caribbean woman who said, my parents came here after the Windrush, and they saw these statues and they thought, why are all these people up here? And they were just puzzled. They couldn't understand why these people were on pedestals. And then you saw, okay, that's the English and the, kind of Christotic ways. And then I remember in 1998, we go to Bristol to do an African Remembrance Day to remember the victims. And we asked the mayor, why is this place full of all these characters who, killed people and treated people terribly and they're on pedestals and nothing to the victims? And he didn't have an answer. And then she said, so my parents were puzzled. We raised questions, and then it took since 97, they've been trying to put the words that this guy was actually a slaver and how he made his money with great resistance. And then 30 years later, he comes down or the statue comes down in 5 minutes. It comes down in 5 minutes. So, yeah, those are some very interesting things about what something is happening. How do we name it? How do we begin to talk about it? Who is pushing the counter narratives? Who speaks on behalf of the victims in all of this? As the great men of action were putting up and immortalizing themselves in this kind of monumentalism, which is, and I'm really grateful to you for that in terms of just describing that process, that kind of monumentalism can be a barrier against memory or a way of fixing history. What is it that guy said after the Berlin Wall falls? That it's the end of history. But so it's not the end of history, and so, some of that has been very interesting, and I don't know whether there's a way, you might want to comment on that, and just in terms of that idea of how we name, or how we retake the narrative, how we begin to name that, what has happened in the past, and come up with new terminology.
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly be interested in how you respond with that. But just to bring my own kind of reflections on this, I moved to Bristol just a year before the COVID pandemic, and I was heavily pregnant when that started. Am I allowed to say that? When that started going down. And my partner was there, and he saw it. He was, he had his, he was caught on a image that was then put up as an exhibition in the M Shed, where the curators were asking the Bristolians of what they would like to happen to that statue post those events. I guess there have been multiple
My African
threads
world
here.
broken.
As someone
and a
who
journey
has from an
that I've been on is really trying to
perspective, we can talk
what
about
that world,
and
then that war was about
classics,
really
which
this
informs the
space
forays,
that was put
etc.
together by the British,
And the narrow framing of what our discipline has
before
become
it was put
in
together,
those-
it
in
was
those,
a company town.
sort of couple of
like the Royal,
centuries, and
like the East India Company put India together.
Europeans
So the
think
Royal
they are
Niger Company
the
puts
natural
that
inheritors
part of the
of
world
Greek and Roman
organised, and then
civilization,
the
etc.
state
And you
comes
start to
in and
really
nationalises
drill down and think,
what the
actually,
Royal
what
Niger
kind
Company
of
does.
narratives have we been told since
And
the
before that,
18th, 19th
It was
century?
this site
But
of
there's
this
also another element where I think you do touch
kind of
upon, and it's
violation
the kind
of the slave trade.
of complicit nature.
So
I
as you're
suppose.
trying to work
For
out
me,
how you
it's
get
been
to,
quite a journey to come from a. sort of
unfortunately I have to be like the
totalised
historian,
Libyan
so
Eritrea
I'm not
and
starting from the
sort
top.
of colonial legacy,
I'm starting from the back. And you're trying to work out, well, how did we get
by
there to
Western
the
powers,
1960s? You're finding
and then to
that actually
come to
this
the
thing
UK
has been a
and
long
in
time
some
in the
ways,
making.
appreciate
And
and
then
be
I
grateful.
meet that young girl
Yeah.
who asked me the
Grateful
question, why am I
for
writing
being
about
here.
the
Like
Caribbean?
there's a book here, The Good Immigrant, right there.
And you think, well,
and,
actually
being
the
grateful
Windrush
in that
wasn't the first
respect.
ship to come here.
And then having to learn,
There were lots
as
of other
a
ships
very famous writer who passed away recently, to
more difficult cargo.
decolonize my mind and to realise
So
actually
you start
I need to
to
separate
and
everything that
it's,
I've been taught in
and then
school,
how do you
in
name that?
university, to actually get
We've been doing this work
that
around
narrative line.
returning artifacts.
and
in the
because that's what it
museums
is, isn't it? And you talk about the sort of
and also
where it's a kind
around
of
slavery and
revealing
reparations and people say,
the
oh, it was so
sort of
long ago.
under the
and,
surface, and you
the slaves were
realise
freed
that the
and
kind of
all of this.
infrastructure.
And then you go back 100 years
tell you a certain narrative.
to the
And
anniversary
in a way that reminded
after
me
the
of
abolition of the
Edward
trade.
Said's Orientalism, which
we're
I
in
always come back to.
1907.
It's that kind of
And you look at
infrastructure
the
for
press
so
about
many
it.
centuries, where you've got,
And actually
the
we're
powers
still
that be
knee
that
deep
tell
in
you
empire,
one
so
thing,
it's
and
all
that permeates
celebration about
through
empire.
everything
It's
that
not
we know.
Wilberforce,
and we accept,
it's not that
and we normalise,
we
and we're all
free
in some ways
being slaves.
complicit
Yeah.
in that.
And then 100 years
Yeah,
later,
absolutely. And in some ways, I think
the
in terms of Edward
that is dedicated to trying to
Said, it's
understand what happened.
probably
So what happened between
Culture and
1907
Imperialism, 1993, more than Orientalism, 1978, that has something into common with this book.
the Queen,
In terms of who we name and who we don't, it's nice to get
it's not quite of a
Said's
turn,
name in there.
there's nobody a poet.
Well, we've got the chance. Let's just talk about
But there has
who
been some
is
change. So
informing
what
the
happens
book,
in that
because
100 years, and what
we
happens
talk
in
about
the
those
Windrush
disciplines. I
era?
mean, one of the people, one of the things
To say,
I learnt
actually,
in
there's a
writing
different
it
story here.
was it so important. Obviously, 90% of writing is reading.
Narrative. So how do
And
we
therefore, what we
now
read is incredibly
begin to
important,
name
and
that?
who gets named and who doesn't
I mean,
starts
you're confronted with all these
with
statues,
your
but
citation
when
practices, and your
constantly
citation
on
practices start with who you are reading in the first
I'm
place.
fine. I'm gonna
And therefore, we have to read outside of our reading lists in our disciplines.
gentleman.
So there's actually rather more Ursula Le Guin in this book than you might expect. There's more Maggie Nelson, but even more importantly, there's more Sylvia Wynter. there's more Stuart Hall, there's more Frantz Fanon, there's more Aimé Césaire, there's more Saidiya Hartman, without whose notion of the critical fabulation approach this book would never have been written. And there's more Truelot. Michel Wolf Truelot, the Haitian anthropologist who wrote this amazing book, if you haven't read it, called Silencing the Past, which is really, again, I mean, this is a Truelotian book. What Hartman does in some ways is sort of takes Truelot's idea of silencing, that silences are not, just omissions, they're made. He talks about mentions and silences. He has this great line about silencing the past is like silencing a gun. Hartman encourages us and gives us hope and says that we can fill those gaps with our imagination. And there are stories that can be told even when there is erasure. For me, I'm not using my imagination in that way at all. I'm doing something different. And there are two mottos in this book. I began in actually it was with the work I did on the Calais jungle, and that little book Lond was the first one, and I did the same for British Museums. I gave the books mottos, or sort of mottos emerged, and in this book there isn't one motto, there are two, and so one of them is, which we've already mentioned a bit, is to stay with the fragments, and the second is sometimes the gap is the monument, because what we're talking about here are alternative forms of monumentality, and that's where archaeology as a discipline, for example, is something that can help us look at the world around us, because we know from archaeology and anthropology that there are many, many ways of remembering or having monuments. Think about Stonehenge or West Kennet Long Barrow, and then think about how indigenous communities a lake or a mountain or a natural place of any kind might significantly, be a monument. And monuments are about how we engage with the ancestors, they're about memory, they're about all those things, they're about endurance and survival. Because the body can be a monument, memory can be a monument, a gap can be a monument. I mean, when they pulled it down in Bristol,
yeah, I mean,
do you know what the museum curators the next morning?
But just to bring my own of reflections on this,
they got up really early.
I lived in,
and they went down to the
Bristol
harbour and they fished the old bastard back out of the water.
I'm
old enough to have been at events about the removal of Edward Colston in 1998. It was my generation, over the course of the 90s, when I used to teach at the University of Bristol, that failed by trying to go through what then was English heritage and all that process to do the right thing. And then the museum, they pick it up, and I wrote a piece in Art Review on the anniversary of the Fall,
of what they would like
which I called Let's Keep Colston Falling, which I very much mean, because in many ways it depends what you sort of talk about it for, because all those other names I've given you, there's also another name that's important in this book, and that is Emily Dickinson.
From an ancient history
because Emily Dickinson wrote a poem which is called Crumbling is Not an Instant Act.
etc.
And I'm interested not just in the footage of the falling of
what our discipline has become
on YouTube,
in those
actually on the one side,
couple of centuries,
how you can see that the monument in the form of a Portland figure on the front of Oriel College
civilization,
to apartheid is maybe in part already falling.
What kind of narratives have we been
and
told
also the
since
fact
the
that
18th, 19th century?
I think this is where the hope lies.
But there is also the other element where,
because it turns out that every time a monument falls or a museum object is returned,
I suppose,
it has taken
for me,
an intergenerational movement. It has taken 30 years, 40 years, half a century sometimes, but eventually they come down. I give a few examples in the book,
occupation,
from the American South and from roads elsewhere and so on. So we have to be very careful about, whenever we talk about restitution, for example, in the newspapers, every generation
there's
it's
a book
talked
here,
about.
The
It's
Good
like we have to
Immigrant,
go
right
back
there.
to square one, and it becomes
and, you know, being grateful in
about
that
ethics
respect,
and
then
how
having
should
to
everything
learn,
go back to
as,
where it
you know, a
originally
very
should be,
famous
or
writer
whatever.
who
All sorts of
passed away
argument,
recently,
a whole load
to
of whataboutism, a whole
decolonise
load
my
of where will it
mind
endism.
and to realise,
Whereas the
actually,
hope lies in
I
the
need to
intergenerational
separate
movement. So the people in this
everything that I've
room
been taught in
who have seen what
schools,
appear
in
to be
university,
failed
to
movements in the
actually
things that
get
matter
through that
to you
narrative
in any
lie.
part of politics, not
And
just
because
the
that's
work
what
that we're
it
talking
is,
about
isn't
here,
it?
but
And
anything.
you talk about the sort of
That
where is the
intergenerational nature
revealing
of how change and sort of
the
progress
sort of
is made is
under
where
the
I found real
surface,
hope.
and you realise
in
that the
this.
kind
So
of infrastructure,
that's why the book is
everything
not
has been
called
normalised
All
to
the
tell
Monuments
you
Must
a
Fall.
certain narrative.
I mean, that's the Gary
and
Young
in a way that
approach.
reminded me of Edward Said's
If anyone,
Orientalism,
exactly.
which
So I
always
don't
come
know if
back
I'm
to,
allowed
is that
to
kind
mention
of
sort of bookmarks in this
infrastructure
place.
from
If I get in
so
trouble
many
if I mention
centuries,
that other
where
radical
you've
booksellers
got,
are
you know,
available.
the powers
But
that be that tell you one
Al
thing,
isn't
and
listening,
that
doesn't matter. Gary and I are doing an event in
and we accept,
November in
and we normalise,
Bookmarks,
and
where
we're all
he,
in some
he,
ways
he can ask me about what I say about his argument. He argued all the monuments must come down. And actually, in some ways, in a post-fascist Italy, that is in part. I was in Italy the other week, and they were saying, well, actually, we sort of stopped doing any sort of figurative statues after 45 for a very long time. But it's not called all the monuments must fall. It's called Every Monument Will Fall, which is just an archaeological observation. It's an observation about heritage management. We keep what we wish to and what we choose not to, but who is the we, and what is that pronoun doing? How are decisions made? In the case of Oriel College, there was a democratic decision made by the college in 2020. It was reaffirmed in 2021, and then very slowly nothing happened, and the pressure was put on from government, the pressure was put on from the donors, well, from people that said, from who knows where. I mean, you can look up all the people that have recently given millions to the University of Oxford and work it out, because we're not saying their names, are we, today? So we don't have to. But some of it's in the book, and some of it is in the name of some art centres. But ultimately, that's the point. That's undemocratic. That's not how, in my view, how heritage value works and how we make, we as a nation, as communities, as institutions, should be making decisions.
That is really important to, I suppose, to cut through that noise of this,
which is really, again, this is a
purposeful
true Trulloian book.
quotation mark culture.
What Hartman does in some ways is sort of
erasing
takes
history. We can't
Trullo's
be,
idea of silencing, but silences are not
pulling down statues, because
just omissions, they're
what
made.
we've done in that
He
book is
talks
also
about
give examples
mentions
of
and
when
silences.
statues
He has
have
this
been
great
pulled
line
down
about
and
silence
have
in the
been
past is like
pulled down,
silence in the gut.
by governments, by
Hartman
sort of
encourages
councils,
us and gives us
etc.
hope and
There is
says
this sense
that
of,
we can fill those
actually,
gaps
you
with
know,
our
it's
imagination, and there are
that
stories
if you're
that can be
giving
told
a democratic
even when there is
to,
erasure. For me,
act
I'm not
to
using my
people,
imagination in
and
that
of
way
course
at
it is
all. I'm
public
doing something
memory,
different,
isn't
and
it?
there are
It is
two
something that
mottos
is not,
in this book. I began in
sort of
actually it was
immovable.
with
It's
the,
not
the
something
work
like
I did
where
on
people
the
like
Calais
to
Jungle,
fix history.
and that little
That's
book
right.
Long
Really
was
annoying
the first
thing
one, and I did the same
as
for
an
British
ancient
Museum. So I gave the
historian
books
to keep
mottos.
saying to people, oh my
or sort of
goodness,
mottos
our
emerged.
job as a
And in
historian
this book, there
is
isn't one
actually
motto, there are
to
two.
rewrite history
And so one of
because
them
of
is,
new
which you've already
evidence,
mentioned,
new
a bit,
emergent
is
evidence, and to
stay
contextualise,
with the
etc.
fragments.
But it's that kind of
And the
being
second
caught
is
in these kind of
sometimes
supposedly
the
cultural
gap
wars
is
that
the
are
monument.
so,
Because what we're talking about here are alternative
what's the word
forms
I'm
of
trying
monumentality.
it's
And
so
that's where
progress
archaeology as a
happening,
discipline,
because
for
there's so much
example,
all that noise,
is
and I
something
want
that
to
can
come
help
back
us
to
look at the
recent
world
events
around
that
us,
have
because we
happened.
know from
And we were
archaeology
talking
and
about this
anthropology
earlier on today.
that there are many, many
in
ways
terms of the response of the
remembering
work
or
that you've been
having
doing
monuments.
with
Think
the
about
parliamentary group,
Stonehenge, or West
and the
Kennet Long
responses
Barrow,
by,
and then
you know,
think about
we're not
how
talking about,
indigenous
government
communities
MPs or
a
whatever,
lake
but
or
we're
a
actually
mountain
talking about art institutions
or a
and
natural place of
organisations
any
who have
kind
responded
might
in a way
significantly,
that is
be a
just
monument.
stopping
And
that progress happening. So
monuments are about how we engage.
Yeah, in terms of the work, we
memory,
we
about all
called
those things, about endurance,
the policy brief,
survival.
which was presented
Because
through this
the
all-party
body,
parliamentary group on
memory
African
can be
reparations,
a gap can be
laying
When-
ancestors to rest,
when when they pulled
and then just looked
it down,
there's been a long tradition from Sarah Bartman of Africans being displayed in museums, heads being taken as trophies, measured, all this stuff.
And they went down to the harbour.
And you have a kind of overhang of this that goes on kind of quietly in these museums.
Events about removal of Edward Colston in 1998.
And so we wanted to raise the issue. There were three things that
my generation over the course of the 1990s
generally were asking for. One was to ban the sale inhuman remains. So at the moment, it's illegal to purchase ivory because there's an ivory ban, but you can actually purchase human remains, and there's a trade in human remains. That is going on very quietly,
which I very much mean,
auction houses,
in many ways it depends what you
various places.
talk
So
about,
we're saying,
all those other names
can we ban that?
There's also another name that's
now,
important in that,
most people have
in this
said,
book,
even
and
government,
that is Emily
yes,
Dickinson.
something needs to be done about that.
Emily Dickinson wrote a poem.
The second thing where there's been
which is
a
called
little bit more resistance
Crumbling
was the
is
second
not an
demand, where we're
instant
saying
act.
we shouldn't really be
And I'm
displaying
interested not just
people's
in the footage
ancestors
of the falling of it
in
that we can
these
all watch
museums.
on YouTube,
So you
but
go to the
actually
British
on the
Museum,
one
there's a
side,
floor
how
where
you can
the
see
so-called
that,
mummies are,
the monument and the
and we go there on a Saturday, Sunday afternoon, take a selfie next to human remains. And, you know, as archaeologists, we know that one of the signs of civilization from 30,000 years ago we discovered in Africa was where a body had been buried, and we say. So we've known for 30,000 years that about how you dignify the dead, and in many cultures give them that peaceful resting place. Sarah Bartman was actually on display after all the horrors committed against her in the 19th century until the 1970s in Paris. So this is not not just her on display, but her private parts were on display, because it was supposed to be
about ethics,
unusual.
How should everything go back to where it originally should be, or whatever.
So we're saying, can we stop the display of this? And this is meeting a lot of resistance. I mean, I don't quite understand why. And then the third point that I think, and Dan's we've been working together on this, is really that,
in any part of politics,
you know, if you have a firearm, you're supposed to have a license for it. And a reason for why you're doing it, even if it's only an old firearm that's on the wall or something, you have a license for it. So why can you have boxes of human remains in your basement, as all the museums do?
Gary Young.
And sometimes universities. We don't know who are in those boxes, they're just there.
Sorry, I think
without any kind of
he's
regulation.
fine.
So we said there should be an audit and some form of regulation. Again, there's been some pushback against that. And so we're in this very strange place where you're trying to say, well,
in some ways, in a
you know, people say, oh, you know, the mummies are...
Italy, that is in part, I was in Italy the other week,
they're not harming anybody or all of this. But if
stopped doing any
the Zimbabweans want
statues after
the skulls of three of their heroes in the first War of Independence, or first resistance war that they fought against the British at the end of the 19th century, and nobody knows where these heads are. They believed, or we all believe, that they're in the Natural History Museum, because after they were captured, they were hung, and then the heads were cut off and the heads brought back for whatever purposes, and now nobody can find it. Where, you know, the Natural History Museum are saying they don't know where these heads are, and you know, the Zimbabwean government, their descendants in Zimbabwe are saying we want, you know, our ancestors back so we can bury them. The government have created a space for them in Heroes Acre.
So we don't have to. But some of it's in the book, and some of it is in the name of some art centres. But ultimately, that's the point. That's undemocratic. That is so much of this abuse of human bodies. That's not how, in my view, in the long history of heritage value work, castle capitalism, it may well be that museums are not an aberration as institutions. The history of enslavement and the trade.
And that is it's really important to, I suppose, to cut through that noise of this purposeful quotation mark culture wars, the erasing of history. We can't be, pulling down statues, because what you've done in that book is also give examples of when statues have been pulled down and buildings have been pulled down, by governments, by sort of councils, etc. So there is this sense of actually, it's that if you're giving a democratic sort of
but we need to understand
act to people, and of course it is public memory, isn't it? It is something that is not sort of immovable. It's not something like where people like to fix history, and that's the really annoying thing as an ancient historian, to keep saying to people, oh my goodness, our job as a historian is actually to literally rewrite history because of new evidence, new emergent evidence, and to contextualise, etc. But it's that kind of being caught in these kind of supposedly cultural wars that are so
they used it
what's
to
the
pass
word I'm
around
trying
chocolates.
to, it stops the
Until
progress
2015.
happening, because there's so much all that noise. And I want to come back
There is a name
to
on that
recent
story,
events that
but
have
it's not the name
happened,
of the person
and we were talking about this earlier on
whose
today,
body used
in terms of the response of the work that you've been doing with the all-party parliamentary group. And the responses by, we're not talking about, government MPs or whatever, but we're actually talking about art institutions and organisations who have responded in a way that is just stopping that progress happening. So, yeah, I just want.
Yeah, in terms of the work,
and some of the evidence fits with
we
that
call
story. But the point is,
policy
the
group,
destruction of identity, the
presented
destruction of
to
knowledge is
parliamentary
a part of
group
where the
on,
violence sits.
African
So how do we try to tell this
laying
person's
ancestors to rest?
Afterlife and find some identity sort of to them, find some dignity. In this case, I do tell the story of how this item, this person, was bought at Sotheby's in 1884 by the man after whom the museum in which
And you have a kind of
the work is
overhang
named.
of
There's a lot of this in the book, of having to move around without saying people's names. Very, very careful in the book about who gets, something my editors have really pushed on. Yeah, the grandson of this and whatever.
Three things that
We don't want to centre certain people above others. We've had a lot of names. We've heard about Sir Hartman and Frans Fanon. We don't. Yeah, that's the point. We don't. What if we try not to? That's the point. What if it's an exercise in seeing if we don't centre them, and we try instead to centre this person who has been not only decentered but dehumanised in those ways. So we take it back in that way. But the point is, the reason that I want to tell that story is that there are unknown hundreds of thousands of people whose fate has been to end up in a cardboard box in a museum. In some cases, if the provenance work was done, there would be communities who wanted returns, and the Zimbabweans may turn up in the over half of the objects at the British Museum that aren't even on a database. Maybe they're there, who knows? But the point is, there will be also examples where where the identity has been destroyed. What should we as a society do in those instances? What is the ethical and the treatment? What does dignity look like? How, at the very least, can we start with transparency? So a part of what the book argues for is really transparency about how we treat the dead of all kinds. How do we remember the ancestors of all kinds, who include some of the people that with a couple of objections at the front we're not naming or trying not to name this evening, but also the other people, because they have been unnamed. That's the point. The others have been unnamed, so why should we foreground? When you write a museum label, when you write a history like this, it's very easy to put the name of the Major General or the missionary or whoever on that label and not have, so it ends up as another monument. And in some ways that's what happened in the case of, I almost said his name then, of Bristol, when they put the image on its side, almost to say, this guy, right or wrong. It's another memorial, it's another centering of that person. He was dead, longer than he'd been alive when that item was put on display in 1895, a long time after the actual man had died. So this aesthetic, this militarist realism encourages us to mix up the man and the monument. It also encourages us to mix up memory and history.
Exactly. Absolutely. I was actually living in Bristol at that point when the Bristol Museum was reconsidering of how to display mummies in that museum. And what was intriguing was they went through some process. Clearly, we were visiting quite a lot, living in there, and they've got an amazing family areas. I've got 2 kids, and it's brilliant. And what they did was they, and the first initial phase was to just to blank it out, and you had the opportunity to switch the light on to see the remains. But there were questions posed, asking you if this was right, etc. And then the next phase was the actual, sort of response from the public to say, actually, this feels wrong. And therefore, then the next stage for them was to remove that from the display. So in some sense, I think there are certain institutions that are trying to get that kind of democratic response from people, because attached to that is, you want to jump in, don't you?
Really quickly on that.
Yeah, go on.
Is that okay? Because Onyekachi will
Yeah.
So that's why the book
Oh, right. Oh, God,
seeks
right.
to
Is this breaking news?
try in the history, because so much of this abuse of human bodies, and in the long history of carceral capitalism, it may well be that museums are not an aberration, that the history of enslavement and the trade in living human bodies gave way in the middle of the 19th century, as the book argues, to the use and abuse and sale of dead
extremely
bodies,
interconnected.
racialised
It's a
dead
small
bodies
world.
in our museums for 100 years or so. And then after the Second World War, 1948 again, that kind of time,
forgive me,
we see the introduction of
a female
mass
black
incarceration.
historian
So the
who
work
is
of
looking at
abolition, as we learn from the
sort of
abolitionists,
recentering,
I saw a copy of Abolition
the
Revolution
stories of the transatlantic
on the wall
slavery. And she was
back there,
looking at
fantastic
why
book near
is
the
it
entrance
that
if
the
you
hundreds
want a
and
good
hundreds
book
of ships
on contemporary
that
abolitionist movements.
took the
The work of
enslaved,
abolition, the work
nobody
of
knows
emancipation is not
what they
over,
were named.
but we need to
However-
understand its histories as well.
However, you have
So what this book
huge
in part
kind of,
tries to do is to
narratives
take an
around the
example
Mayflower,
of
etc. So
this
I think
person's body
sometimes it's just that,
and
that
the dehumanisation, the
legacy endures,
denaming.
that
We're not
legacy of
meant to know who
erasure
this person is.
endures, and
There is a
obviously
name on the silver
agree with
rim that's
Dan
been
in terms of,
applied
like,
to the top of
recentering
this
those
person's
voices,
head.
because
The
obviously certain
skull, which has been
voices have
lacquered
been
and
amplified
polished and turned into a
to the
chalice and
detriment
used to serve
not just the
wine at
ancestors,
the
but
dessert
also
in an
the
Oxford
descendants,
college.
and it's
And
a
then
sense of,
when
like,
the
giving
abuse was such
dignity,
that it
not just for ancestors, but also
the wine was
people
leaking,
right
it began
now,
to
right
leak. They used it to pass around the chocolates until 2015. There is a name on that silver rim, but it's not the name of the person whose body was abused, like the woman. We know it's a woman from the physical anthropologists who say in terms of the form and the size. We know from a radiocarbon date that this person died sometime around sort of 1790, 1800. We know from circumstantial evidence that the story is that she was a Caribbean slave, and some of the evidence fits with that story. But the point is, the destruction of identity, the destruction of knowledge is a part of where the violence sits. So how do we try to tell this person's afterlife and find some identity sort of to them, find some dignity? In this case, I do tell the story of how this item, this person, was bought at sort of Sotheby's in 1884 by the man after whom the museum in which I work is named. There's a lot of this in the book, of having to move around without saying people's names. Very, very careful in the book about who gets, something my editors are really pushed on, the grandson of this and whatever. then it comes down again. We don't want to centre certain people above others. We've had a lot of names. We've heard about Sadiq Hartman and Frans Fanon. We don't. Yeah, that's the point. We don't. What if we try not to? That's the point. What if it's an exercise in seeing if we don't centre them, and we try instead to centre this person who has been not only decentered but dehumanised in those ways. So we take it back in that way. But the point is, the reason that I want to tell that story is that there are unknown hundreds of thousands of people whose fate has been to end up in a cardboard box in a museum. In some cases, if the provenance work was done, there would be communities who wanted returns, and the Zimbabweans may turn up in over half of the objects of the British Museum that aren't even on a database. Maybe they're there, who knows? But the point is, there will be also examples where no identity, where the identity
and just
has
around
been destroyed.
that story,
What should we as a society do in those instances? What is the ethical and the sort of treatment? What does dignity look like? How, at the very least, can we start with transparency? So a part of what the book argues for is really transparency about how we treat the dead of all kinds. How do we remember the ancestors of all kinds, who include some of the people that, with a couple of objections at the front, we're not naming or trying not to name this evening, but also the other people, because they have been unnamed. That's the point. The others have been unnamed, so why should we foreground? When you write a museum label, when you write a history like this, it's very easy to put the name of the major general or the missionary or whoever on that label.
So we came back and said to the museum,
it ends up as another monument. And in some ways, that's what happened in the case of, I almost said his name then, of Bristol, when they put the image on its side, almost to say, this guy, right or wrong. It's another memorial. It's another centering of that person. He was dead longer than he'd been alive when that
and then the statue in Bristol
was put on display in 1895, a long time after the actual man
24 hours,
had died. So
they moved it.
This aesthetic, this militarist realism, encourages us to mix up the man and the monument. It also encourages us to mix up memory and history.
Gentleman that he might have been next. So they moved. That was an interesting kind of behind the scenes thing. But I think the point for me about all of this is that part of this narrative is being challenged and is being, as you said, we want to give voice to those who have been erased, to the victims who were, after all, a large part of this story. But you wouldn't know it from the way that the history is being told. And people always say to me, well, why is it all happening now? It was such a long time ago. And you have to remind them, as I try to remind a young Caribbean woman who was questioning me about Windrush, that actually this was a 500-year kind of entanglement that was very difficult, and in that 500-year period, the African was either enslaved, made a second-class citizen, but generally was the African's inferiority
really
was
quickly
codified.
Is that okay? Because Onyekachi will not.
And then the struggle
will not
has been in
know.
all the
I just need to tell you something that I should tell you, which is that when we got it sort of is, because I haven't completely made the connection. But the letter that was sent by a series of archaeological organisations against the report that you put together for the All-Party Parliamentary Group, one of the organisations. President was working in that institution,
and it's not really until 1994
I'm fairly sure
that
was
it ends.
against those changes, and therefore there's history that continues there. We should talk about that later.
Now is a process of looking back at what the price was paid for the ticket, and so that process is not going to go away. People are looking back at the victims who died. We haven't been able to talk about that because generally what's been involved is trying to remove whether it was in Zimbabwe, Angola, and the next indignity, and then that ends in South Africa, which is why South Africa, it was such a big moment for the African world. And so now we're looking back at the victims, and we want to tell their stories as part of this period of history, which they were co-creators of. And so that's the process. And thank Dan for the receipts in Every Monument Will Fall, because he shows who some of these men of action were and what they were trying to do, and why that monument, that process of monument.
Yeah, exactly. If I could give an example from London, we did an event a month ago or so at the Museum of London Docklands, which I guess now we're meant to call London Museum Docklands, because it's not the Museum of London anymore, it's London Museum. I've got to say London Museum Docklands really doesn't quite sound right, but I'll try and... Anyway, that's what it's called. And we were talking about the statue of the enslaver that used to stand outside there, and it's a really, really good example of how memory culture can be reshaped, but also understanding the history. So this image of this man, it was put up in 1807. It was made by a sculptor who did a lot of these things, who was married into Caribbean money, who I talk about a fair bit in the book. It was there from 1807 until 1942, when it was removed in the war. In 1997, when they were doing up the Docklands, and the Docklands, the sort of Thatcher initiated, companies that were putting in all the rail links and all that around the wharfs, and the money that came in Canary Wharf. The image was sort of pulled out of storage and went back up outside what then in 2003 became the Museum of London Docklands, London Museum Docklands, whatever you want to call it. Then it comes down again in 2020. We were having this conversation with a big group of people there, and somebody pointed out that it is still in the building. It's in the basement, so actually, in theory, it could go back at any point. But what they're doing is, I just want to say the reason that Ursula Le Guin, so the Mayor of London, she wrote, has as a commissioned sculptor called Caleb Brooks, trilogy, and a poet in that writing, and in so sorry I don't know at this moment. She wrote, it was called The Rule of Names. She writes which is going to replace and it's going to be called The Wake, anthropologist, and it's going to remember not some of these histories, which is less positive, but the survivors, which is where the K in Ursula's slave trade. And it seems to me that is a wonderful example. But the Rule of Names of how memory cultures can be reshaped, not only because it is what a community naming is important, but also knowing names have been for so long is about power, and that power can be misused and used in different ways. But often naming is very important, and that's why I'm happy that as Onyekachi was talking, I managed to Google, even though there isn't much internet in here, Ursa Daly Ward's name, who is the poet who is going to have the poetry on the Caleb Brooks statue, or monument rather, which is called The Wake in Docklands. Because the statue was so that's the first thing to say, I think, in terms of, really seriously, there's been a bit of chuntering on the front row about sort of whether this is serious or not. But it is serious. The question of who gets named and who doesn't. I think, we've never needed something like world culture museums, monumental culture, disciplines like archaeology, anthropology, art and architecture more than we do in the present. We need those fields. And we need to be able to talk about them honestly without being told that we're entering into something called a culture war. I'm so sick at the moment in this moment we're in about woke, where it isn't even woke that is the word that's used. It's just that people will say to people like us on the panel, I'm sure a lot of people in the room will hear it, oh God, can't you just be a bit more positive? Why can't you just be, why is it all so negative about racism and colonial murder and slavery money being used in the present and inherited into the heart of the University of Oxford? I mean, what on earth are we talking about? So I think We have to be optimistic, though, and this is, it's a question of who are the activists here, who are the culture warriors, who's being negative and who's being positive. We need to fight on the left. We need to fight for the argument that we can work with culture. We can learn that from Stuart Hall. We can learn it from, there's a bit of Gramsci in there. There's even a bit of Althusser who talks about how we become involved with these structures and institutions and forms of knowledge where we start to take it personally ourselves. And we start to think that anyone saying that our institution or where we work or the thing in which we were trained should change, that it's an attack upon us sort of personally. We ourselves start to mix ourselves up with the ideas of other people from the past. Or indeed from other sort of parts of society, from the ruling class. So I think that's where the hope lies: is that we can reform these disciplines, these institutions, and these memory cultures. It will, though, involve an intergenerational struggle. It will involve educating ourselves about the history of these movements and refusing to make it about generalised ethics, but understanding case by case these histories. So it isn't that every monument, there should be no monuments and no museums and tear it all down. Instead, that framing, the culture war framing, because it's actually a war on culture, not a culture war, that weaponisation of culture has a history. It's a shallow history. It takes us back to the 1870s, into the 1920s, maybe 1930s. And there's a bit in the book, if you read one bit of the book and you go out on a field, because you can do lots of field trips around London with this book. One of them will take you to the Strand. If you go to Covent Garden, walk north onto the Strand, you can see what is outlined in the book, which are the desecrations of the Jewish artists' sculptures. Jacob Epstein, not Epstein. I'm thinking Epstein. Jacob Epstein, which on the day after the opening of the Nazi Degenerate Art exhibition in Munich, the Rhodesian High Commissioner had defaced, and they're there still as monuments themselves to the fact that the real vandals are the racists and the colonisers in this conversation.
I'm going to give the last word.
Dan for it's just about the whole monument reform. Two things very quickly. After the gentleman, the statue of the gentleman in Bristol comes.
Monument, the process of monumentalising happens in young people who bring it down. Interestingly, it's at the end of the American
doesn't convict.
Which was really American Civil War, right up to around 1935,
I remind people when they say, well, across the Atlantic world all the time,
I was just going to say that this is probably the best time to conclude, but I wanted to say, reading your book, there have been moments of when I've been angry, just the nature of things, the nature of current things, and my inability to change things as an individual. But also, I think it's a message of hope and positivity too. So, we may be talking about it in this kind of sort of not negative and depressive way, but it gets really hard to get bogged down, by the current political narratives, and you think, my goodness, we're talking about 21st century, the movements have been going on across the world for so long, why are we starting back to square one? But I just want to pass on to Dan to give that message of positivity for the next steps of where you see this, and possibly the recommendations that you might want to pose.
Sure, okay, and so I'll do that swiftly and then we can open it up for questions. First off, though, I just want to say the reason that Ursula Le Guin is in the book is that she wrote, as a kid, I read the Piazzi trilogy, and in that writing and in a short story that she wrote that was called The Rule of Names, She writes about how, and I talk a lot about her father, an anthropologist, and his involvement in some of these histories, which is less positive, which is where the K in Ursula K. Le Guin comes from. But the rule of names reminds us not only that naming is important, but also that knowing names is about power, and that power can be misused and used in different ways. But often naming is very important, and that's why I'm happy that as Onyekachi was talking, I managed to Google, even though there isn't much internet in here, Ursa Daly Ward's name, who is the poet who is going to have the poetry on the Caleb Brooks statue, or monument rather, which is called the Wake in Docklands. So that's the first thing to say, I think, in terms of, really seriously, I've been a bit of chuntering on the front row about sort of whether this is serious or not, but it is serious. The question of who gets named and who doesn't. I think we've never needed something like world culture museums, monumental culture, disciplines like archaeology, anthropology, art and architecture more than we do in the present. We need those fields. And we need to be able to talk about them honestly without being told that we're entering into something called a culture war. I'm so sick at the moment in this moment we're in about woke, where it isn't even woke that is the word that's used. It's just that people will say to people like us on the panel, I'm sure a lot of people in the room will hear it, oh God, can't you just be a bit more positive? Why can't you just be, why is it all so negative about what, racism and colonial murder and slavery money being used in the present and inherited into the heart of the University of Oxford? I mean, what on earth are we talking about? So I think we have to be optimistic though, and this is, it's a question of who are the activists here, who are the culture warriors, who's being negative and who's being positive. We need to fight on the left, we need to fight for the argument that we can work with culture. We can learn that from Stuart Hall, we can learn it from, there's a bit of Gramsci in there. There's even a bit of Althusser who talks about how we become involved with these structures and institutions and forms of knowledge where we start to take it personally ourselves. And we start to think that anyone saying that our institution or where we work or the thing in which we were trained should change, that it's an attack upon us sort of personally. We ourselves start to mix ourselves up with the ideas of other people from the past, or indeed from other sort of parts of society, from the ruling class. Yeah. So I think that's where the hope lies, is that we can reform these disciplines, these institutions and these memory cultures. It will, though, involve an intergenerational struggle. It will involve educating ourselves about the history of these movements and refusing to make it about generalised ethics, but understanding case by case these histories. So it isn't that every monument, there should be no monuments and no museums and tear it all down. Instead, that framing, the culture war framing, because it's actually a war on culture, not a culture war, that weaponisation of culture has a history. It's a shallow history. It takes us back to the 1870s, into the 1920s, maybe 1930s. And there's a bit in the book, if you read one bit of the book, then you go out on a field trip, because you can do lots of field trips around London with this book. One of them will take you to the Strand. If you go to Covent Garden, walk north onto the Strand, you can see what is outlined in the book, which are the desecrations of the Jewish artists' sculptures. Jacob Epstein, I'm thinking Epstein. Jacob Epstein, which on the day after the opening of the Nazi degenerate art exhibition in Munich, the Rhodesian High Commissioner had defaced, and they're there still as monuments themselves to the fact that the real vandals are the racists and the colonisers in this conversation.
I'm going to give the last word to...
No, yeah, it's just about the hope, and I two things very quickly. After the the statue of the gentleman in Bristol comes down, there is a court case, and the young people who bring it down are prosecuted, but the jury doesn't convict, which was really interesting on two grounds. And then secondly, I remind people when they say, "Well, why do you talk about this all the time?" and it's you're being negative and all of this, that the biggest mass movement in this country for a long time was the anti-slavery movement. And when you engage on these issues with ordinary people, every time I've talked to people at the British Museum and about the display of human remains, people very quickly get it. But there are a group of people who don't want this to happen. And what I remind everybody is that at the time of the anti-slavery movement, there were a group of people who didn't want that to happen either, and they dominated the House of Commons at the time, and the Lords, because most of them had, slaves and property and other property in the West Indies and elsewhere. So they had an interest in why they didn't want things to happen. The mass movement did ensure that eventually it was abolished. And now the descendants of many of those people who still don't want things to happen, now turn around to tell us that the great example of British virtue was the abolition that their grandparents resisted. So in another 100, 200 years, their grandchildren will also turn around and say that the work that we're doing now is another great example of British values. So that's my hope.